All right. It is 10 o'clock on February 1st, and I was talking to one of my colleagues today, and we've maybe never heard so many people be glad that January is over. Apparently, it's been a rough January for a lot of people. Welcome to Seattle's brand new Building Emissions Performance Standard, What You Need to Know Now presentation that Nicole is going to run today. I am Katie Sealing from the Lighting Design Lab program with Seattle City Lights, and my colleague Madeline will be in the background with me addressing some questions so Nicole can focus on the presentation. I'm going to go over some housekeeping rules in a second, but we're going to try this little Slido. If you have not used Slido before, you can get your phone out and scan that fancy little barcode, or go to slido.com and type in that number to access our little polls. And there's another way to do it. There's a passcode if you need it, DHIJIS. Maybe I'll throw that in the chat. Oops, somebody can't hear me. Nicole, can you hear me?
I can hear
Yeah,
you.
good. Okay. I'm sorry, John. Um, and let's go for our first question. If the slide goes, there it goes. We're just wondering where you are calling from. Well, where you do most of your work. Um, the building emissions performance standard is specific to the city of Seattle, but we've got franchise cities for City Light who might be interested in knowing what's going on. Other cities are. Oh, I'm glad you fixed that, John. You can now hear me. Other cities are looking at implementing emissions performance standards too. So Nicole has lots to teach them. Okay, we've got, well, that's a pretty good representation. 50 people voted or so. And then I'm going to go to the next slide. And this is a thinker one. Um, we want to know what you are hoping to learn today. So, what brought you here? I'm going to give you a few seconds to answer that. Just as an FYI, there are almost 400 people registered for this webinar today. The Lighting Design Lab is usually a pretty niche audience, so getting 100 in is a lot for us. Oh my gosh, Nicole, they want to learn everything. I hope you have a slide on everything. Um, so we are going to manage this webinar just a little bit differently than kind of we usually do. We usually have everybody on mute anyways, and that's going to be consistent in this webinar. You're on mute, sorry. There's just a lot of you. There is a questions icon at the top, and you can ask questions at any time. But because this is such a dense, complicated topic, we're going to let Nicole do part of her presentation without interruption, and then we'll address those questions. So ask them anytime. We're not ignoring you if you don't get an answer. We'll just have a Q&A kind of halfway through-ish, and then again at the end. And because there are a ton of you here, we might not get to address everyone. We are keeping a transcript of all the questions you ask so that we can address any that are that we don't get addressed. Okay, and I think I went over all this. You're on mute. There's the little icon to look for. This chat icon, you might see if we paste a link or something in, that's where that will show up. This webinar is being recorded, so there's a transcript of everything that you type in. And if you have to step away or you want to show this to a colleague afterwards, I get this up on our website, lightingdesignlab.com, within about a week, usually, as well as a copy of the presentation. And very importantly, there's a survey after we're done, after we close the webinar. This 8-question survey pops up in your browser window. Would love if you answered some questions after the webinar. Really quick, some of you probably have no idea what the Lighting Design Lab is. We are a program within Seattle City Light. We've been here for more than 30 years. We used to have a building up on Capitol Hill and then down in Soto. That's the picture on the bottom. It was formed by the BPA and a bunch of Northwest utilities to fill some education needs to transform the lighting market from incandescent to fluorescent 30 years ago. And we are a pretty well-known resource within the lighting community, but now to help fulfill some of the city's goals, state's goals of decarbonization, we work closely with OSE, and we've expanded our offerings to include whole building support. And that is it. We've got a couple classes coming up on strategic energy management, which you might be interested in, especially if you are subject to BEPS, as a way to sort of document a continuous improvement on how you're going to manage your energy in your buildings. And that is all I have for now. So I am going to hand it over to Nicole. Hopefully we have a ton of people already in and ready to go. Nicole here, oops, make presenter. There you go. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Katie, for that great introduction. I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share my screens now. We did this a couple times in practice, so fingers crossed it's going to work. And we're sharing it. Okay, Katie, can you let me know if you are seeing my screen?
I am seeing your screen now.
Great, that's a good sign. I think that means that hopefully everyone else is seeing it too. So thank you so much to the Lighting Design Lab for hosting this presentation today. It's really great to see that so many people have joined and are interested in this topic. I also was scanning as you were typing in what you were hoping to learn today, and I think I'm going to cover about 90% of your questions. So hopefully, you'll get most of what you need. If not, there are other ways to get information. So again, I'm Nicole Ballinger. I'm with the Office of Sustainability and Environment. All right, so as Katie mentioned, we do have a lot of material to cover today. So we're gonna break this up into a couple parts. Part one, I'll give you some background on the policy. I know that we are all coming from different places of knowledge about what you may know already, if you've really been tracking this policy or if it's brand new. So hopefully this just helps level set a little bit for everybody here. Then I will dig into the BEPS requirements at a high level, looking at the actual requirements and the compliance timeline. Then we're going to get into part three, and this gets a little deep in detail, but we'll talk about pathways to compliance. Then we'll probably all need a break. I'll take about 10 minutes of clarifying questions. Then we'll do a couple quick net zero emissions examples from some case studies. And then lastly, in part five, we'll do a little estimating of greenhouse gas emissions intensity in a target. Just a very simple way. This is something that I'm sure a number of people on this call already know how to do. So if you need to drop off, attend another meeting at that point, I will not be offended at all. All right, so I think as just about everybody knows, the city passed its Building Emissions Performance Standard, or BEPS, because it's faster to say, just last December on December 13th. So it had unanimous support from City Council as part of their Committee on Climate Action, and also had very strong support from the mayor throughout it. We really built a consensus-based policy during the signing, and throughout it, we worked very hard and were joined by representatives from affordable housing, labor, and also environmental advocates as well. So this policy took more than 2 years to craft, and during that time, we engaged many voices to shape the policy. We had hundreds of input from stakeholders. We had more than 125 focus meetings or one-on-one conversations. We had 4 open houses with about as many people on them as are here today. We spoke with building owners. We had a technical advisory group. We had an affordable housing advisory group that was hosted by Housing Development Consortium. And just a very robust process, and also had great support from our Green New Deal Oversight Board. So with this policy, we really were looking to address multiple priorities. To not just mitigate climate change and reduce pollution, but to also just consider, what are the other priorities faced by our communities, by residential and commercial tenants, by labor force. So for example, for the need for environmental justice, very real present concerns about downtown revitalization, a just transition for workers, and keeping housing affordable. Before I go further, I've been using this term building performance standard, or BEPS, multiple times. So let's just level set on what that is. So a BPS requires existing buildings to meet carbon emissions or energy performance targets by specific deadlines. Another word for an emission standard is just in general decarbonization, another word for reducing emissions, whether that's in a building or say in the transportation sector. The map that you're seeing is a map of all the cities that already have some sort of performance standard. If it's a green dot or the state is green, it means that city or state has a performance standard. The blue are those cities that are already in the process in some way of considering them. So Seattle is about the 13th city or state to pass a performance standard. So why are we doing this? Well, buildings are one of the largest sources of Seattle's climate pollution, comprising more than 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. And as many of you know, we've had for quite a long time in Seattle a climate action plan to reach net zero by 2050. But despite all the amazing work that has been done with incentives and codes, you name it, amazing work of buildings and developers, we are not anywhere near on the trajectory to meet those 2050 net zero targets. So really need to do something more significant. So in Seattle, we do have a great opportunity here because we already have extremely low emissions electricity supplied by city light. And so 90% of the building related emissions actually come from burning fossil fuels within the building. And that includes gas and oil that may be used in furnaces or boilers. That also could be district steam that might be generated offsite and then piped to the buildings. And the environmental impacts come not just from the use of them, but also during extraction and distribution. So from a environmental justice standpoint, doing this also is very important because Black and Brown communities are the closest and most exposed to this pollution and most impacted by climate change. So both from the climate justice standpoint and meeting our net zero goals, BEPS really is one of the most effective actions we are taking. So this policy is projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 325,000 metric tons by 2050 from existing large buildings. In other words, that's about a 27% decrease in the building-related emissions. Overall, for Seattle emissions overall, it's about 10%. And that's kind of like taking about 72,000 gas-powered cars off the road. So what are some of the benefits? Of course, tenants and owners could have lower utility bills and more comfortable spaces. Investments can create local well-paying jobs. These includes things like refrigeration mechanics, electricians, sheet metal workers, engineers. These are high-quality local jobs that can't be outsourced. And fewer fossil fuels in buildings means the less risk of accidents, hazards, and cleaner air indoors and out. All right, so now that we've got that background under our belts, let's talk in a little more detail about what the Seattle BEPS actually requires. So the BEPS covers about 4,100 or so non-residential and multifamily existing buildings greater than 20,000 square feet. So on the screen are just a couple examples. This would include anything from like office towers, various sizes of multifamily, retail, community centers. What's really important to know is that it does not include new construction. Those buildings are covered by energy code. It does not include industrial manufacturing buildings, and it doesn't include small commercial and multifamily that might be less than 20,000 square feet in size, and it doesn't include single family. So what is actually required of building owners? So the basic framework is that every 5 years, there's basically 3 different things and then the final target. So first of all, energy benchmarking verification. As many of you know, we've had an energy benchmarking requirement for about a decade now. So there'll be a new add-on to that to every 5 years to verify the prior year's building energy use and emissions. Along with this new requirement, there also will be some type of short report. We're not expecting a detailed plan at this stage, but just to report the emissions performance and a plan to document the current equipment and some general information about future actions to meet the targets. Then when they are phased in, meeting the actual greenhouse gas intensity targets or GIDGETs using 3 pathways. I'll talk about that in more detail later. And then finally, achieving net zero emissions with narrow exceptions between 2042 to 2050, depending on the building type and size. For those of you that know our tune-ups policy, we are also phasing that out over time. So here's a high-level overview of the timeline for compliance. So we're in this policy development stage right now. We have the director's rule to work on this year that will specify more of the details. For example, like what is the documentation that the city will require for an exemption, and when do you need to submit it by, those types of things. But in 2027 is when the energy benchmarking will be starting to be required, and that plan that I talked about. And then moving into 2031 to 2035, that's when the first initial targets will need to be met by those timeframes. And they'll ratchet down over time. Non-residential buildings meeting the standard target path would have to get to net zero sometime between 2041 to 2045. And then multifamily have a little longer time frame going out to 2050. Just on the bottom, showing roughly how this aligns with the trajectory of the Washington Clean Buildings Standard. I'll talk more about that policy in a moment. So since it's a little easier to think about what's going to happen or what needs to happen in the next 10 years thereabout, what I've done on this slide is just spelled out, what are the upcoming timelines to have on your schedule and to be planning for. So we're using the same size cohort as the Clean Building Standard, as the state standard. But as you can see, there is that verification and reporting requirement starting in 2027 for the largest buildings. And then the largest buildings would have to meet their GHGI target by October 1st of 2031. And you can see how it's phased in with these other size thresholds of buildings. So the smaller buildings do have more time to prepare. All right, lots of text on this slide, but I do want to make sure that everyone knows that there are qualifications to report for the BEPS policy. If this looks familiar, it's because they're actually the same ones that the state of Washington requires for their standard. So it's 3 years of professional experience in energy use analysis and any of the following certifications or licenses. I won't read these out, but CEM, architect, engineer, various things here. They should look fairly familiar. Should say the reason we align that is because we know that folks are already working with providers to meet the state standards. So we wanted to make sure that you could use the same provider if you're already working with someone. Okay, so now this presentation is primarily about Seattle BEPS, but we get a ton of questions, totally understandable, about how does this policy align or not with the state standards. So here's a quick 2-slide overview. So performance targets, we've got a state standard with energy. We are working on emissions. That is because we need to have emissions targets within Seattle to meet the actual climate action goals here. We are using the same covered building sizes and the same building types of non-residential and multifamily, but just remember that for the state standards, the tier 2 buildings, which are the smaller commercial, less than 50,000 square feet and multifamily, at this point, they only have the reporting requirements. So the requirements are a little bit different. There is some reporting in each, but we're not having the same exact ones, but we do hope you'll have some synergy between those two. And then the reporting deadlines, the state standards come into play a little earlier for actually meeting the targets, and ours are a little later. We do have alternative compliance options for both policies. I'll talk more about the Seattle ones in a few minutes. I already mentioned the qualifications being the same. There is free technical support for both policies. On the Seattle side of things, we're definitely growing ours to include more about BEPS. The state already has its incentives framed out. We are planning on them and working on them for the Seattle BEPS. And the penalties is just a comparison slide there. I'll talk more about Seattle's penalties later on in the slide presentation. All right, so moving on to part 3, diving into more detail on pathways to compliance for Seattle's BEPS. Okay, so during the stakeholder process, we heard a need for a lot of flexibility within this policy. We recognize it is challenging to decarbonize buildings. So that means it's also complicated policy to explain. So what we've tried to do is put this into 3 kind of high-level paths, A, B, and C, and I'll talk through each of those, give initially here and then give more detail as I go through the slide. So path A is meeting the standard GHG targets using either an individual building or a portfolio. Path B is meeting those targets, but you might have a couple of variances. Say, for example, you're able to use an end-use deduction for certain fuel uses, for certain emissions, such as restaurant cooking. There is an alternative compliance payment. And path C is really a unique path for buildings that can state eligibility criteria, and that would be a customized decarbonization plan. So let's talk first a little more about path A. So this is the standard targets chart that's just pulled from the legislation and made a little bit prettier for this slide. So you'll see we have various different building activity types. The targets are set for 2031 to 2035 in the legislation. They will not be changed during this upcoming rule process. The ones in the future that are in italics, part of the flexibility is that those could be updated. Okay. So we have these different categories. In terms of understanding, how does portfolio manager relate to those categories? Basically what we have here is on the right side is a list of portfolio manager space types. And these are ones that have been reported to the city and how we actually, in creating the targets, rolled those up to create those higher level building activity targets. The reason for that was that, for example, fire station and police station, even though different buildings, they actually had very similar EUIs, very similar greenhouse gas intensities when we were doing the target setting. So they, either one, you would use that fire police station target. Same thing with warehouses. Distribution centers and warehouses are very similar, so they're going to use that same non-refrigerated warehouse target. So a couple flexibility options in path A to keep in mind, and there will be more details coming in rulemaking, but for example, if a building shows during the energy benchmarking verification process that it is using only electric only and it's the building, that building could be exempt from the GHG IT requirements and reporting for all intervals. They'll have to keep verifying it every 5 years, but they can be exempt. I already talked about that the first targets are set and that the laters could be adjusted. Emissions factors are the same way. The first ones are set, though they might be a little bit updated, but not significantly between now and 2031. Portfolio campus connected buildings are allowed to use the standard targets path. They would use an aggregate of all the space types in all their buildings to create the target. And then this gets a little complex, but I can answer more detail about it. But there is also an alternate GHGIT. This is for buildings that are really unique uses. They don't have a building activity type. For example, I don't know why when I think about this, I think of roller rink. I don't know why. But in any case, that would be a straight line target. So based on the building's baseline, doing a straight line to net zero. This also alternate path is available for buildings whose baseline GHG intensity is extremely high, that it's already 3.5 times their standard GHGIT. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this path B. So again, path B is, generally following the standard target paths, but we recognize there's just things going on in buildings and need to have that flexibility to plan over time. So there are some options for an alternative compliance payment. This is just in 2031 to 2035. That would be a payment based on the metric tons that you're over the target. If you're just over a little bit and you want to just pay that, that's an option. Also exemptions, obviously, for demolition, exemptions if there's extreme financial distress, high vacancy rate, the percent will be determined in the rules. And then end use deductions. So emergency backup generators, the emissions from that is exempt for all compliance intervals. Other things like backup heating in hospitals, communications equipment, fossil fuel equipment that's in an individual residential condo unit. End use deductions that are available now but will expire over time are things like cooking, various process loads, and also really importantly for the downtown building owners, I know, is if you have a district energy contract in place, for example, might be a Centrio customer, you could deduct the emissions from steam for that 2031 to 2035. And that's to allow time for that system to do some decarbonization itself. So it'd be decarbonizing at the source. Also, really a lot of flexibility for multifamily. The reason we have this included is because, there are obviously strong concerns about affordability happening. So there's a prescriptive path, some opportunities for buildings that are qualifying low income or human service uses to get some different extensions, and also some important considerations for residential condominiums, like that deduction of equipment in the individual condo unit, also being considered all electric when all their space and water heating systems use only electric energy. Okay, so let's finally wrap up this section with, or we're close to wrapping up, sorry, a couple more slides. We'll talk about path B with some flexibility here. So this is this custom decarbonization plan. Again, there's going to be, I think this is one of the meatier things to hit on the director's rule. But essentially what this does is that it gives an option for flexibility for buildings that might meet the eligibility criteria. And these are all the criteria sort of listed briefly on the screen here. So for example, if a district campus, like a hospital or a university campus that has its own district energy system, it could create a custom decarbonization plan for that campus. Another example might be if a lab building has some very critical sort of ongoing research in a very controlled environment. If meeting targets could be shown as that they would interrupt that work significantly, the owner's qualified provider could propose a plan, and that plan, for example, might include a revised target to exclude that space or a revised timeline for when the work could be accomplished. That's what we're getting at here. So generally, most plans will still mean meeting net zero emissions by 2050. However, we recognize there may be some really extreme circumstances where it's just not feasible to get to net zero completely. And in that case, a low emissions plan may be an option to propose. Okay, so owners again will need to apply for this option each compliance interval and then sort of reapply if they want to update it. It will need to include an engineering and audit, energy and emissions reduction measures, and a cost analysis. Okay, before we move on to just covering the penalties, just want to talk about some compliance flexibility that's baked into this requirement. So first of all, our goal at the city is really to support action rather than have owners pay a fine. So for instance, the alternative compliant payment option is available for the first interval. Just if you're a little bit over, you could use that option instead. There is also a 360-day grace period after the deadline before any fines are issued. So there is additional time. Say you're having some challenge with M&V at the end of a project. We also can reduce the penalties if an owner can show that they really were working very hard to meet the target but for example, something didn't quite go right with the work and they're still not more than 20% above the target, their penalty could be reduced. And broadly, the director has authority to mitigate fines based on review and appeal, and also to establish grace periods, and that would be across the board for penalties. So let's say, for example, we have another pandemic. Like if that were to happen, we could establish a grace period for that. We have that ability. Just want to highlight in the box there that, we have some best practices already. We've had 95% compliance with both energy benchmarking and the tune-ups program. So really expect that we will be ramping up and be able to offer a high level of support for this compliance with this program. Okay, so, but then getting on to penalties. So there are some fairly stiff penalties. First, just failure to report are not terribly big. Inaccurate reporting could also be assessed a fine. But the main one is not achieving the actual target. So those are up to $10 per square foot for large non-residential buildings. Is somewhat smaller for multifamily buildings. That's because they have the longer timeline trajectory. And then buildings that are low income or low rent would have a $250 per square foot fine. Just another little quick glance on support. So we are planning our BEPS support as we're also concurrently planning for our rulemaking. Do expect that it will include, all of the things listed here: help desk, case studies, fact sheet. We already have our Clean Buildings Accelerator. We're just kicking off roughly our second year of that. We have a coaching session starting at the end of February, and we still have space in it. So we've started out with that program to help folks meet the state clean buildings mandate, but we are rolling in emissions reduction more and more over time and really aligning it with, okay, how do you get some support to meet both policies? So encourage you to check out that program. We are also working towards funding various engineering and capital investments that are listed here, and that's ongoing work. All right, so now we're at a little pause break, and because I know I just put a lot out in about 30 minutes there. So I know Katie and folks have been flagging some questions. Yep. So do you have any?
We have a few. Yeah, it's not overwhelming. I'm just going to start from the first one we got and make our way through. Okay. Ian Brown wanted to know, hopefully you can decipher this. Anybody who's been on these knows I know like a quarter of what I'm talking about when I ask questions. Okay, so it says weighting of spaces for multi-use allowed.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Ian. Yeah. So Ian's talking about if you have a building that has multiple spaces, like a mixed use building, say it's retail and office, to set your target, you would weight it by the percent of those spaces in the building. I'm actually going to show an example like that at the end if y'all stick around. But and that's similar to how the state does it for setting their EUI targets. So yes, we can do that. Okay. And actually want people to do that. It gives definitely a more accurate target.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you, Ian. And then Cameron wanted to know for exemption for demolition, quote unquote, within 3 years of compliance deadline, is that a plus minus 3 years? So you kind of have a 6 year window?
No, that's 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very Cameron, we're gonna, I think, propose a pretty similar process to what's been allowed for using the exemption um, the demo exemption for building tune-ups. So it's in that 3 year range and similar documentation. But that's, yeah, we're definitely thinking that the 3 years. 6 years is that's a long time. Um,
And then Cameron had another question.
all right.
Oops. I scrolled away. Do you have any more info on how GHGI reduction from renewable natural gas will be considered?
Um, I I don't have anything more to share at this time because we're going to talk about that more in the rulemaking process. But generally, I didn't cover this, and so it's a good question to ask. So this is a decarbonization policy. So the use of renewable natural gas will be allowed. What we have written in the requirement in the ordinance is actually that you would have to get an attestation from the provider, and that we will also be working with that provider to understand what the emissions factor is of that renewable natural gas product. And that emissions factor is essentially based on what the feedstock is. Say if it's waste product, that emissions factor could vary. So it will be basically using an emissions factor exemption. Also recognize that there's probably some work to do with portfolio manager to track that as well. But Energy Star and EPA, they're making updates because they know, as you saw, many cities are doing these BEPS policies. So yeah, don't have exact examples, but and I think that's information I'd shared, but with you, Cameron. But this is for everybody. Yes, you can use RNG, and we'll have more details on exactly how to claim that and use that to as part of your compliance path.
Cool. Okay, and Bonnie wanted to know, could a publicly owned campus's custom decarb plan be the same plan as its state requirement for 2023's House Bill 1390 legislation?
Oh, that's a great that's a great question. Um, I would say at this point, I don't say I can say definitively yes or no to that question because we have to go through the rule process. And I know the rulemaking for 1390 is in process right now, so kind of waiting to see what happens there. But um, hoping to allow some alignment as much as possible so you're not kind of reinventing the wheel on that. But I would say overall that's to be determined. I don't want to leave the impression it's going to be like exact one for one, but I think certainly there would be some opportunities to combine those two. And we are talking with the state about, okay, how can we do that?
Okay, that's good to know. Um, oh, did my mic? There's my mic. Um, Heather would like to know where the money from penalties will go.
Great question. So yeah, the monies from penalties and also the alternative compliance payments will actually be there's some language in the ordinance about it that basically says that they have to be used for emissions reduction in other areas with a priority. I think 40% needs to be prioritized for like frontline communities, under-resourced communities, communities with high RSJ indices. So in general, they won't be just gone, taken to a general fund. But the idea is that if we get penalties from non-compliance here, that we would work to fund emissions reduction in other building sectors. So, for example, funding heat pumps in low-income single-family homes or townhomes or things like that.
Okay. Um, Molly would like to know, is new construction not included in the program? The Path B compliance slide mentioned extensions for new construction, but an early slide said new construction wasn't included.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that is that's a little confusing. So new construction is when it's built is covered by the Seattle Energy Code, and it doesn't need to then immediately comply with the BEPS standards. So essentially could, but it will eventually, assuming it's not already meeting the targets. Our energy code here is very strict, so we don't expect that many new buildings would be in the situation where they would actually, have to meet the initial at least 2031 to 2035 targets. But either way, they can get, just apply for an exemption once they've been occupied for more than 3 years. It's really similar. What we're thinking is, so this exemption has been part of the building tune-ups requirement of proposing applying the actual sort of mechanism of it in a very similar way. That new construction would not have to comply until it's at least sort of 3 years in occupied. So that effectively has you kind of like jumping the targets. So yeah, sorry if that is confusing. I think we need to find a better way to explain that one.
Okay, well, luckily this is recorded, so you won't lose lose the question. And Danielle is wondering, are the reporting procedures the same as the Washington State CBPS through Energy Star?
Oh, yeah. Um, Not exactly. We're definitely using Energy Star for just tracking what the baseline energy use is of the building and continuing our energy benchmarking requirement. Do not recommend you make any changes to, at this point, to your benchmarking report. But because we are allowing some of these additional deductions, so for example, the cooking deduction, right now there's not really a way to deduct that within Portfolio Manager. So we are expecting that we will have to have some additional reporting on top of what's available from Portfolio Manager. So, looking at what the sort of raw GHGI is, and then taking some of those deductions and then getting what the final compliance GHGI is.
Okie dokie. And then Jennifer wondered if you need to choose one pathway for your entire portfolio, or can we choose different pathways for individual buildings?
It's a great question. If you choose the portfolio option and you're using an aggregate GHGIT of your portfolio, then you're not complying at the individual building level. You are complying at the portfolio level. Otherwise, if you want to do individual buildings, you kind of just need to do all individual buildings. So it's kind of a one or the other. Um, There'll be more detail on that coming in the rules, but that's the intent of the requirement for portfolios. Any other questions? I'm not hearing Katie at the moment. Okay.
Yeah, I think Katie froze, so let me see if I can jump in here
Okay.
and
And I think
pick
we're
up.
just about at 10 minutes anyway, so maybe just one more
Okay.
question, Eric.
Let's see if I can find one of these. Oh, there was a question about the $10 per square foot per year, and maybe define what that applies to and what that doesn't. The penalty.
Yeah. Yeah. So $10 per square foot. So it's for that entire 5-year compliance interval is the $10 per square foot. So it's not actually per year. So hopefully that helps a bit. You would basically, if the building didn't meet the requirement, they would get assessed that fine. It would be based on $10 per square foot for the total area of the building. And then it would be assessed one time and it would cover that 5-year
Okay, yeah, one time for the
complaint.
5-year period. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll bow out, and Katie, you're back on.
Okay. Sorry for the glitches,
I,
folks.
yeah, I apologize. I'm in the building downtown. I don't know. It's quit on me a couple of times. So apologies. And I feel all of your glitches too when you write it and say things aren't working. Do you want to move on now, Nicole, or do you want to take a couple more questions?
Let's take one more question. I advanced the
Okay.
slide, but we take one more question because the next
Okay.
sections don't go are pretty quick.
Okay. So the next one is Dave would like to know if the policy is anticipated to be based off ASHRAE 100, like the states.
Oh, that's a good question. No, it's not based off ASHRAE 100 because that's energy standard. It's its own emissions standard, and so it's unique that way. That's why we're not referencing exactly the same requirements as the state. It's a great question.
Great. Good. Yeah, there are a lot of great questions. So we're going to save um, many of them for the end now. Let Nicole get through the rest of this presentation, and we'll see how many we can get to at the end.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for
Thank
all
you.
those great questions. You definitely recognize there's a lot of complexity to this policy. I'll include a link at the website at the end. We do have some 4-page guides that essentially cover a lot of what I'm talking about today. And one of the other reasons for the long timeline on this is that we recognize there's a lot of need for guidance and supportive materials as well to sort through this policy. So before I move on to the last section, which was doing a very quick estimate of greenhouse gas intensity and a target, just want to highlight a couple net zero emissions examples. The ones I'm going to share are based on a couple concept plan, or one's a concept plan, one is a finished product that were done a few years ago. As I mentioned, we already are actually working on a couple other models to make available into case studies in the next year or so. So let's advance this slide again. There we go. Okay. So the first one, Stewart Manor, is a low income housing building that's owned by Seattle Housing Authority. It's really common type of building that's for a lot of affordable housing in Seattle. The building has electric resistance heating in each of the residential units, and it has a common hot water system that's powered by gas right now. So OSE partnered with UW to evaluate and develop a plan for eliminating fossil fuels from this building. Goal was also to reduce energy use and utility costs and improve health and resilience. And a limitation of this concept plan was that tenant disruption needed to be minimized. So the basic strategy for achieving net zero emissions was to replace the gas central hot water heater with a more efficient electric heat pump. But looking at the plan more holistically to get some additional efficiency savings, other measures were identified, such as adding roof insulation. And one that really had a lot of benefit to this building as a concept was upgrading the corridor ventilation for improved energy efficiency and also for improved indoor air quality. Also thinking about the challenges we have right now with wildfire smoke and extreme heat days, part of this plan would be to add cooling to the community room. It has very minimal impact on energy use. It would just be basically a mini split heat pump, but it provide a safe space for residents on site to go during heat and wildfire events. So they wouldn't have to travel, take a bus to a community center. We didn't consider any wall or window upgrades because moving the tenants out wasn't feasible. It also was very expensive. And so while Seattle Housing Authority is not implementing it, this project at this building, they are using the learnings to do some implementation measures at some of their other properties. Okay, the next case study, and this case study is available on our website. We can probably put a link at the end, or maybe send it out with the follow-up slides, perhaps, Katie. So this is actually a completed project, and it was really a whole building retrofit. This was a fun case study that we partnered with on City Light. They did some amazing work working with the state's Department of Energy Services on this project at the State Department of Services for the Blind. Basically, the starting baseline for the building was that it had gas boilers for space and water heating, and it had a failing chiller providing cooling to the building. And so the key measures to do this project were to replace the gas-fired hot water and heating system with electric heat pumps. They did do a really extensive upgrade on this building. This is potentially not the norm, but is an opportunity that some buildings might want to go down this type of path. But they addressed energy. They replaced the cooling system. They replaced the windows. They upgraded lighting. They improved the building controls. They also did an improved ventilation system. Those energy measures led to a 70% reduction in energy use. It significantly reduced the building's electrical load, in fact, so much that they did not need a service upgrade to replace the gas boiler with the electric heat pump system. The other really cool thing about this project is that the tenants, the Washington Service for the Blind, that they were able to stay open during the entire 18-month remodel. All right, so last section here is talking about estimating just a pretend building's greenhouse gas intensity and greenhouse gas intensity target. Some of this will be pretty familiar to most folks. So again, to just do a little level setting, we want to just cover, what are we measuring or tracking? As I mentioned, this is a greenhouse gas intensity target. So essentially a GHGI target is the total annual weather normalized fuel use. We are requiring weather normalized for each of the energy sources serving the building times the emissions factors of those energy sources. And then you get the total kilograms CO2e equivalent per year. Then you take that number, divide it by the building's square footage, and you get the intensity of it, which is the emissions per square foot per year. These are the emissions factors pulled directly from the legislation ordinance. So right now we've listed the main ones that we know. For obviously City Light, Puget Sound Energy, and Centrio, our main utility partners here in Seattle. As I mentioned earlier, renewable natural gas would have to be provided, but that's forthcoming. So in the ordinance, we've included emissions factors for the baseline greenhouse gas intensity for folks that want to do some estimating. So that's the emissions factors I'm going to use in this demo. And then there are some provisional emissions factors for the upcoming targets. As you can see, they're the same for PSE and Centrio. It's a little bit lower for City Light. That is because City Light is actually working to further reduce the emissions from their already very low emissions electricity. And we will, in a rule, make a final update on what any of these factors are well before 2031, so that you have the knowledge to kind of know exactly what that final compliance GHGI is. But for now, you could estimate with either the baseline numbers that are here or the provisional ones. I'm just going to use the baseline ones. Really importantly in red here, please do not use the Energy Star Portfolio Manager emissions factors. What's really important is that Portfolio Manager uses the regional grid for electricity, so it kind of wildly overestimates what the emissions are for electric here. So we don't want you to use that. The good news is that EPA is really aware of this. This is not just a problem for Seattle, it's a problem for other cities. So they are actually currently working on upgrading Portfolio Manager so that people can actually use their more localized emissions factor. So expect that to be resolved pretty soon. Okay, so a couple different ways to estimate your building's GHGIT. So first thing is just a reminder, we have our Seattle Energy Benchmarking Map. The link here is on the top of the page. You can go find your building address up here in the search bar, and then click on View Building Report. And when you do that, you'll get this handy little report. And over here in the right-hand corner, right now, it's going to show you what your emissions are per square foot. That's the closest way to just say, okay, what's my rough GHGI at this point? You can also look for a little more detail on what the impact of your different fuel sources are. So right now we have some information on here about estimated targets for people to meet the state standard. Our benchmarking team is actually working on revising this tool so that will actually include an estimation of the buildings that are benchmarked of what their actual greenhouse gas intensity target. Expect to roll that out this year. But so the short story is making this an easier to use tool for folks. So if you want to do this a little more detailed for your own buildings, here's a couple steps here. So we're just going to look at an example office building. It's a mixed use building. It's got 75,000 square feet of space. You can see that broken down by some office, retail, and a gym. To estimate your GHGI and your GHGIT, it's essentially 3 steps. First, you're going to estimate the GHGI, then estimate the target, and then just compare those two numbers. Is it higher or lower? If you end up with a higher number, you're going to have to do some work to meet the target. Okay, so first, let's look at doing a quick estimate of a building's greenhouse gas intensity. So from Portfolio Manager, you can download and find your annual weather normalized energy use by fuel source. You want to pull it down in kBTU per year. It's really important to use a standardized unit. Otherwise, you'll have to convert from therms and kWh, and that's more math. So just pull down the annual weather normalized annual energy use. Then use the emissions factors that are in the ordinance. Multiply that fuel use times the emissions factor. So you can see for gas, it's about 2 million kBTUs annually times that 0.053. You get your annual emissions each year, about a number of about 116,000 there on that second row there. You'll subtotal all those numbers, then divide it by the gross floor area of the building, and you'll get the building's greenhouse gas intensity. Here's some guidance to come. So you'll see I put a little row in here for eligible deductions. So for example, you would do kind of the subtotal, and then after rulemaking, and we come up with a process to deduct cooking emissions, that's where you can then subtract that and we would end up with a lower number. And so then that would have the result of your actual greenhouse gas intensity of being a lower number as well. So just a couple things listed here on some of that guidance to come to be able to do that deduction. But for now, we're just going to pretend this building doesn't have any deductions. So next, to get to your GHGI target, go back to looking at your building activity type chart and your Portfolio Manager building space types. Again, we are working on tools to make it a little easier to do a quick conversion of here's what I benchmarked as, then use this target. But for example, here it's an office, so that's pretty easy. Use the office target. If you're a gym, in Portfolio Manager, it's going to show up as fitness center, health club, gym. You would use the recreation target, and retail stores, pretty basic here, circled. So you'd go back to the chart, find those 3 different target numbers. So you've got office, recreation, retail store. Going to take those, put them in a chart here. Again, we'll be making early tools for people to do this. So to get the target, This is where you're doing this prorating of your by the space use. So remember at the outset, we said the office was 60,000 square feet. That turns out that is 80% of 75,000 square feet. So you would multiply that by the activity GHGIT of office of 0.81, and you would end up with that prorated GHGIT of 0.64. You do that for each of the space uses in the building. So retail, gym, your recreation target, and you add those up and you get, for this building, a GHGIT of 1. Totally just was random that it came up to be a nice even number like that. Wouldn't expect that normally. So guidance in rulemaking to come. We are looking at normalization for operating hours. For example, if you're familiar with the Washington state standards, buildings that are, say, operated 24/7 can use a normalization factor. We're also doing some research looking at normalization for occupancy density for multifamily right now, and also need to cover some space use rules in rulemaking. But right now, for a basic estimate, say your building doesn't have any unusual operating hours, it's pretty straightforward. You could get a pretty clear estimate here of your GHGIT. And these are the targets for 2031 to 2035. I'm only doing this upcoming deadline. So then you're just going to look, does the example office building meet or exceed the target? So looking at it here, we've got our intensity of 1.74, the estimated target of 1. It's over the target by quite a bit, 0.74 in this just hypothetical building. So this building would be needing to look forward and figure out, okay, what's my path to compliance? What are my different options here? Okay, this building's not 3 times the target, so it wouldn't be able to use that alternate compliance path, but it could look at various options. All right, and so with that actually went by pretty quickly. So we got lots of time for additional questions because I'm actually seeing from Katie that there are a lot of other ones coming through.
There are. Can you hear me? It looks like I might be losing internet again.
I can hear you okay.
Okay, good. We have a ton of questions. Thank you, everybody, for being so engaged. I'm going to kind of start off from where we left off. And actually, before I get to questions, I did become aware that Slido was being used to ask questions, and I did not make it clear at the beginning that Slido was just for the beginning of the webinar. So I apologize if that was confusing and you asked questions in Slido. We'll try to get those addressed too, but I'm going to go through the ones that are in the question box in the webinar right now.
Okay. And Katie, should I just leave my screen up for now in case I have to go back to another slide?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, all right. So let's see. We have Bill asked, for an all-electric building with a restaurant using natural gas, so just a tiny percentage of the total energy use, can the restaurant be exempt?
Just thinking through that question. I would say no, because looking back at the at the targets, there's actually a higher target for restaurant. I think you might have said it's a tiny bit of square footage, so maybe that wouldn't help you. But you would still want to go through the process of actually deducting that energy emissions from that cooking. So again, some guidance will be provided in rulemaking. There's actually some other cities that are grappling with this issue, so we're looking at a couple different options to propose. But definitely want to hear from the industry about, is there a process you might recommend or use?
Right, that's right. A lot of this is not going to be really known until the rules are all made. And then, oh my goodness. Okay. Oh gosh. I don't know what Michael was referring to. But he said, is this based on ownership of the spaces like the state, or is it by building as a whole, say like a co-op commercial building? But I'm not sure what,
Hmm.
Michael, you were referring to. I'm sorry.
Hmm. I'm not. Sorry, I'm not sure exactly what the question is there, and I don't want to assume.
Right,
I don't know if that person's still on, and I don't know if you have an opportunity to unmute people, or maybe you could retype your question. Um,
right.
yeah,
Michael,
sorry.
yeah, give us a little more info if you're still on. Um, and then is Colin would like to know, is there a cutoff date for buildings recently completed / currently under construction to be subject to BEPS?
Oh, good question. So, question on, if a building that, say, it's maybe under construction right now,
Mhm.
um, there is, so I believe it's within the exemption. I have to look it up. But if a building was permitted, its equipment permitted under a recent energy code, I think it's under the most one or two recent codes, um, there is a time. One of the things in rules is that we recognize that that building essentially may open with some brand new equipment, say a brand new fossil fuel furnace or something like that. Um, there's an equipment lifespan um, exemption opportunity that essentially is looking at, between, when it was installed and sort of it's a standard measurement of end of life. The standard measurement, one reference is the ASHRAE guide to equipment life cycle. That might be one that, we would recommend in rule to reference. And then another thing to cover in rule, is it up to 100% of that time frame that you could deduct those emissions, or is it 90%? But there is a consideration for that problem. I think that's the most important part, is to know it's like, yes, we heard that. It's a concern. There's always buildings, that are still being built that might be built under the prior energy code where they didn't have to use all electric. So there is an opportunity there. Um, if you want, if you want to send an email, I can put the email in the, it's cleanbuildings@seattle.gov. We can certainly send you a reference to where that is in the ordinance, that text detail, but we
Clean
will,
buildings with an
yeah. Cleanbuildings@seattle.gov.
with an
Sorry,
X.
I thought it
Yeah.
used to be in my
Okay.
Q&A slide, and I don't know where it went.
Oh, okay. I just put it
So thank you
in the
for
chat.
that.
If it sends, there it goes.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we may have sort of addressed this earlier. Carolyn asked, can the decarbonization plan for Pathway C align with House Bill 1390 decarbonization plan requirements?
Yeah, we did talk about it earlier, but happy to cover it again. I think Bonnie had asked that question. So I think, as many of you are tracking, the state clean building standard has a rulemaking process underway now for House Bill 1390 that is allowing campuses to use a decarbonization path. They're coming up with the rules on that now. So our team is following that rulemaking process. I can't say for sure because I don't know exactly what the end product is going to be of that process. But yeah, we are looking for ways to align what the state is doing as much as we can with what our local requirements and needs are. So to be determined, but that's our goal. We're tracking that process too. So thanks.
Okay, and then can you still hear me? My camera went away. I apologize, everyone in the audience.
Yeah, I can
I
hear you fine.
I don't know what's up with the municipal tower today. Okay, so one wanted to know regarding deductions for high intensity process equipment in hospitals, do each of them have to be metered?
Okay, yeah. Question about high intensity process equipment in hospitals. Um, we we are not expecting in rulemaking to try to create something super onerous, to say, okay, you've got to sub-meter every little load, that obviously could be expensive and challenging, but we do need to come up with a coherent process, for those types of things. So for example, in a hospital, if it's steam being used like for an autoclave or something like that. Now, if you're on the district downtown system, it wouldn't be a problem for the first compliance interval because you'd be able to deduct all of the steam, but recognizing in later time periods it might be. So that's a very good question, and definitely an area of research and looking to the industry. If you have recommendations for what might be a process to have, some sense in your hospital of what those loads are in aggregate to be able to adjust those, would be helpful. So thank you.
Okay, and then Michael, he wrote in and clarify. So if there are different owners for different parts of the building, do the owners have to meet compliance as individuals, or does the building as a whole need to meet compliance as a single entity?
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that question.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Okay. So a couple different scenarios. So cover the easier one first. So, most of the time when we have multiple owners in buildings, it's like a residential condo situation where, each person owns their own condo and they have like a community association. So in that case, the community association would be the entity that would be required. They actually are considered an owner in the definitions for the requirements. So we have a lot of those. I know there are also some situations where there might be commercial condos that have separate ownership. Because those are separate owners, then those would be probably individually required. We find that's fairly unique. I know this has come up a couple times in the administration of the tune-ups requirement, and I think there's some guidance there on that we can probably propose. So wasn't sure if you were asking about residential or commercial, but recognizing there's a couple different scenarios there. Hopefully that was helpful.
All the bases. Oh. And then there were a couple of questions about weather normalization. So can you explain what weather normalization means and how you would find it?
Okay, sure. Yeah, not a super expert on this, but weather normalization is basically a way of taking the building's annual energy use and normalizing it for the variations that happen year to year in our weather. So it's based on variations in local weather patterns. It's based on heating degree days and cooling degree days. And so, for example, like we all know this, like last year felt like the winter was really cold. This year feels like it's been a little warmer. So the weather normalization would take that into account. People can, so there are some people who will do the calculations on their own. Portfolio manager already has baked in those calculations, and they use the local heating degree and cooling degree days for Seattle in the actual weather normalization that they provide in Portfolio Manager. So there is a way to go in and download that from, if you benchmarked your building, and find those numbers through the Portfolio Manager reporting tool. That's something we can provide more guidance on. I actually had some slides on that, but I know Portfolio Manager's been doing a few updates of their user interface, so I didn't want to share them in case they weren't fully up to date. But hopefully that explains what weather normalization is for you, just in a nutshell. The reason we're doing that is because if your compliance year with BEPS happens to be a really cold year, you might have used more energy and more emissions that year. So we want to be able to use a metric that normalizes that out, so you're not really penalized just because we happen to have a cold winter.
Or a blazing hot summer,
Yeah, what is a good summer?
or a smoky fall where all of your HVAC is turned off. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah, all
there's
the
lots.
things with climate
Yeah,
change, right?
yeah. And so then another real quick, can you clarify what portfolio level means um, in regard to this?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that may be confusing because we have portfolio manager, which is the
Right.
Energy Star tool. We have portfolio. So portfolio, as it's defined in the ordinance, is basically a group of buildings, more than one building, that is owned by the same owner. So, for example, our school system comes to mind. The school system owns Ian will correct me, but it's about 100 buildings or so in Seattle. And so that could be a portfolio of buildings. So, for example, if they wanted to, they could basically do an aggregate of all the GHGIs and create an aggregate target. It would be fairly straightforward because most of the spaces are K through 12 schools in that scenario, but they could comply as a portfolio. So the key point there for the portfolio is it needs to be buildings that are under the same ownership. In most cases in Seattle, that might be institutional buildings, public nonprofit buildings, private sector portfolios. Private sector owners can use the portfolio option. We will have to develop some clarity in rulemaking about how you identify who is the common owner amongst the portfolio, because we recognize that sometimes those have various LLC names that are not as obvious as, say, City of Seattle buildings. They're all City of Seattle owner, right? That's another example. Our City of Seattle buildings might use a portfolio compliance pathway.
Okie doke. And then Jessica is wondering if there's anything in the ordinance about parking or transportation emissions.
Oh, great question. So first, addressing parking emissions. So couple things there. So the threshold for whether a building has to even comply with this ordinance is excluding parking as a space. So if you're a 20,000 square foot building, but you have a 5,000 square foot parking garage, you wouldn't have to comply with this ordinance. I realize it's an unlikely scenario, but it's easy math. So just keep that in mind. But I don't think that's probably not really what you're asking about. Maybe thinking more about emissions from transportation. So a couple things. So emissions, if your building has EV charging, you can deduct the emissions from that EV charging system, recognizing that those shouldn't be exceptionally high because they're coming from an electric source, but those can be deducted. Transportation, other emissions from transportation are not included in this ordinance. So you don't necessarily get a credit if you have like a commute trip reduction program or something like that. That was not included in this ordinance.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think of that, having the commute trip reduction. That okay, cool. Okay, and then I'm learning things too. Anna wanted to clarify if the penalties of the $10 per square foot, if that's per year.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. It's not per year, it's per cycle. So
Mm.
say, for example, if a building just didn't meet the 2031 targets, they would get assessed that $10 per square foot if they're non-residential, and it would be assessed one time, and that fee, that penalty would cover that 5-year cycle. It wouldn't be reassessed each year.
Okie dokie. And then, oops, there it went. Um, do we use gross floor area measured from the inside or the outside of the building? Janice wanted to know.
A great question. So we're following the same rules as we've had with energy benchmarking and portfolio manager, and it's using basically all the spaces wall to wall within the building. So it's not your net, it is your gross floor area, it's not the net. So you include mechanical room spaces, elevator shafts, things like that. Essentially, it's the portfolio manager way of measuring a building for gross floor area. That's what we're using. So, and I'm pretty sure that's the same exact as the state is doing off the top of my head. So should align there. Um,
That would be nice. Um, and Cameron wanted to know, do you expect there will be a BEPS portal, or will we use the tune-up portal or share with the Clean Buildings portal?
Great question. Yeah, we expect there's going to be a BEPS portal. Wouldn't be just reutilizing the TuneUps portal. We have staff that is currently looking into various IT solutions for reporting for this requirement. Um, there's a couple different options. Some cities have various tools that they've deployed already. We're looking at, do we develop a custom tool? But in any case, expect there will be a portal. We're not a state agency. We can't use the state portal, so we won't be using that. But yeah, that is something our team's working on.
Okay, and then a couple questions on the fines. Max wanted to know if there'll be an adjustment if buildings are making progress towards their targets.
Yeah, good question. Will there be an adjustment if they're making progress? So there is text in the ordinance that allows upon appeal, if the building owner or the qualified provider can show that they were working to meet the targets, they actually made some progress, made some due diligence, and if they get within 20% of meeting that target, their penalty could be adjusted. That's just recognizing, but you do have to kind of get within that 20% over the target, which is actually a pretty big range. But
Okay, so that kind of answers the next one where Alex was wondering if there was going to be a dispute mechanism to contest the fines.
yes, within all of the city requirements, and we have this baked into benchmarking to tune-ups. So pretty, I don't want to say it's not a straightforward process necessarily, but it's a standard process that we're required to follow as a city department, that involves issuance of a warning letter, then a penalty notice, and then there is an opportunity for a building owner to appeal that, essentially have a mitigation discussion, and then if it continues on, it goes into a kind of a hearing examiner situation. So that is, there's a whole lot of verbiage on that in the ordinance, and that's nothing we can change or will change in the director's report because we don't have authority to do that. But what we will do is try to just put it into a little more plain language to make it a little clearer on what the actual steps are. That said, our goal is to really try to help entities as much as possible try to avoid that process, with early guidance about, wow, you're really far away from your target. Like, should you consider the decarbonization plan, or should you consider the alternate target or other options? So really, as a city, as an office, working hard to hope we don't get many people that have to go through that process.
Right. And then Alita wanted to know, can you clarify that when it comes to doing calculations, etc., that this is what a qualified person is required to do rather than a layperson or business owner tackling it on their own?
Yes, so a qualified person would be required to do all the reporting, and calculations, or certainly to review and sign off on them. Um, it is important to note that the qualified provider, as long as the person meets those qualifications, they can be either a consultant that a building owner might hire, or if a building owner has on-site staff that meet those qualifications, they could report.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left. Nicole, not you, a different Nicole, she was curious to know about how BEPS will be aligned with upcoming standards for zero emission buildings.
Trying to think about which upcoming standards you're speaking about.
She has a link to energy.gov, so the federal.
Oh, the federal definition of it?
Potentially, Nicole, if you want to clarify, go ahead and write back
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, I know there was a federal a definition. I know they were taking comments on it recently. Um,
Okay, yep, and she said federal.
okay, yeah, that's to be determined. Exactly, how if we align. I think we're waiting on what the final issuance of that definition is. Not something that we need to cover right now at the outset in this rulemaking process, because while we have net zero as certainly a goal and a strong goal for this ordinance, the final targets are provisional, and could be updated at future rules. The timing would be like 5 years before they're required. We would issue what those, have a process, issue what those final targets are. But that's a great question, and it's definitely is something we're tracking. Is what is that definition, and
Great.
as well. Yeah.
All right, you want to take some more?
Sure. What time do we have? It's 11, but I have 3 minutes.
Yes, right.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. These are really great questions. Really appreciate you coming and sharing them, and thinking about this policy so far in advance.
Yeah, and we do have a transcript of all your questions, so they're all going to be, considered, and we have your name, so we can reach back out and provide clarification too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
and I will
we'll,
also say that all your questions help us prepare for rulemaking. They help us
right.
prepare as we're thinking about our educational tools and what we need to provide through our accelerator and other avenues. So this is as helpful to me as it is, honestly, is to you, I hope.
Okay, so let's have this one be the final question from Michael. For portfolio compliance, how can compliance be achieved if some of the buildings use gas? It doesn't seem possible to offset the gas emissions with renewables like solar PV, and the value of PV is marginal given SCL is pretty clean and has low emissions rates.
Okay. Uh, yeah, there's a lot within that question. A couple things
Right.
to pull out from it. First, with solar renewables, RECs from those are not required as part of, or not allowed to be used for this requirement. So with a building, portfolio that has some buildings with natural gas, you will need to think about how to um, you use RNG, use efficiency measures to reduce the amount of gas you're using, and then eventually plan, for asset replacement there over time and conversion, potentially to a less emitting source. I mean, right now, obviously, I think we all know that's electric sources, but this is a long range requirement. Um, so, and one of the reasons those targets are provisional is that if there are some different technologies, whatever, we can kind of reconsider, or the market is having extreme challenges, there's options there. But in general, yes, this is about doing some planning to actually consider over time replacing those assets and upgrading them. Um,
All right. Well, it's 11:30 on the dot on my clock. Um, let's call that good for today. And we thank you, Nicole, for coming in and using our platform to get this information out to people. I mean, obviously, it's a popular subject to talk about, and there are still lots of questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. Thanks, everybody at the Lighting Design Lab, helping to make this happen. And everyone here, really appreciate all your thoughtful questions and time today.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. Reminder, we'll have a recording of this as well as the slide deck on the lightingdesignlab.com website within about a week. Um, we'll have all your questions here in the background. Feel free to write Nicole. I have the Clean Buildings email in the chat, or the Lighting Design Lab if you've got Seattle City Light specific questions. And if you still have brain capacity left, taking the survey when I close the webinar would be so appreciated. All right, have a good lunch, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.